The night my husband wired $2 million to his mistress. He didn't know I was watching the transfer happen in real time. It was just after 11:30 on a Tuesday. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel amplified. The dishwasher hummed in the kitchen. My laptop screen glowed against the dark living room. Daniel was upstairs, supposedly asleep. I remember thinking how ordinary everything felt. How safe. Then my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it. We had alerts set for unusual activity. But most of the time it was nothing, subscription renewals, automated investment adjustments, the normal rhythm of shared finances. But this one was different. The notification banner previewed a number so large it didn't make sense at first. International wire transfer initiated. $2? 000. For a second, I thought it was a glitch, a misplaced decimal, a fraud attempt from some stranger in another country. But when I opened the banking app, the details were clear. Clean, deliberate, outgoing transfer. From our joint investment account. Recipient: L. Mitchell, Toronto, Ontario. Lauren Mitchell, 31. Elementary school teacher. The woman Daniel insisted was just a friend from a community STEM outreach project. My pulse didn't spike the way I expected. I didn't drop the phone. I didn't scream. I didn't run upstairs and drag him out of bed. Instead, I sat very still. Because 3 weeks earlier, after the second time I caught him lying about a late meeting, I had quietly reactivated parallel access rights on every major account tied to our LLC. Daniel had always believed he handled the big money decisions. He liked saying he was the engineer, the one who built things. He forgot I was the product manager who designed systems. He forgot I built the financial structure of our marriage. The transfer status read, pending. That word mattered. I tapped into the transaction details. The routing codes. The intermediary bank. Estimated settlement time. 24 to 48 hours. He must have thought I wouldn't notice until it cleared. Upstairs, I heard the faint creak of the bedroom floorboards. A shadow moved under the door crack. Maybe he wasn't asleep after all. I checked the alert settings. Any transfer over $500,000 triggered a secondary notification to an encrypted email address Daniel didn't know existed. I'd set it up 2 years ago after the first unexplained withdrawal. Back then, I told myself it was precaution, not suspicion. Now I knew better. I stood and walked slowly into the kitchen, phone in hand. The granite counters felt cold under my fingers. We refinanced this house 3 years ago, pulling equity to consolidate debt and expand our investment portfolio. I drafted the restructuring plan. I negotiated the rate. I drafted the operating agreement for the LLC that held our brokerage accounts and rental property interest. Daniel signed every page without reading it. There was a clause buried in the middle of a long, dry paragraph about fiduciary obligations. Any unilateral transfer exceeding a defined threshold could trigger internal review and compliance escalation. He had never asked what that meant. My phone buzzed again. A second alert. Foreign currency conversion confirmed. He was moving fast. I opened the email linked to my hidden alert channel. The notification had already arrived. Time-stamped 11:32 p. Emma. Attached was a compliance note. High-value international transfer subject to review. Good. I didn't confront him. Not then. Instead, I opened our shared cloud drive. Searched for Montreal. Nothing. Then Toronto. A folder appeared. Recently modified. Inside. A lease agreement for a downtown condo. 1-year term. Tenant. Lauren Mitchell. Co-signer. Daniel Harper. My name was nowhere. I scrolled further. A spreadsheet titled Relocation Budget. Estimated living expenses. Flight costs. Furniture deposits. Health insurance options. And at the bottom of the sheet, a cell highlighted in green. Initial transfer, $2. 000. 000. Not half. Not temporary. Not alone. All of it. The realization settled slowly, like cold water filling a room. This wasn't a reckless romantic gesture. This was an exit plan. He hadn't just cheated. He had planned to erase me financially. I walked to the bottom of the stairs and looked up. The hallway light upstairs flicked off. He was moving around, maybe checking his own phone, maybe assuming everything had gone through smoothly. He thought the joint account was effectively under his control. He'd said that once, casually, after I let him lead a discussion with our financial advisor. "You handle the strategy," he'd said. "I'll handle execution." He didn't understand that execution without structure is exposure. I returned to the living room and opened the LLC operating agreement. Scrolled to the section he had skimmed. Unilateral asset transfer resulting in material depletion of marital estate may constitute fiduciary breach and trigger mandatory review. My finger hovered over the internal compliance activation link tied to our brokerage dashboard. If I pressed it, the pending transfer wouldn't just be flagged. It would be escalated. To fraud review. To documentation. To records that didn't disappear. Upstairs. A door closed softly. I imagined him packing a carry-on. Checking flight times. Texting Lauren that the money was on its way. I didn't cry. I didn't call his name. I pressed the button. The system processed for a moment. Then a confirmation appeared. Compliance review initiated. Settlement paused pending verification. Somewhere in the banking network. A file changed status. Somewhere. An algorithm marked our account as high risk. I set my phone down and leaned back against the couch. Tomorrow morning. He was supposed to fly to Toronto. He thought he was leaving with $2 million and a clean break. He had no idea that by sunrise, the account would be frozen. And his phone would start ringing. I didn't sleep that night. Daniel came home past midnight. The smell of airport coffee still clinging to his jacket, even though he hadn't actually left yet. His suitcase sat half-zipped near the stairs. He looked at me like nothing had happened. "Long day?" he asked casually, loosening his tie. I studied his face, searching for guilt. There was none, only calculation. "It was productive," I said. He nodded, poured himself a glass of water, and scrolled through his phone. I wondered if he was checking to see whether the wire had cleared. I wondered if he was waiting for a message from Lauren. $2 million. Our savings. Our refinance. Years of disciplined investing. He had tried to move it in a single sweep, like wiping crumbs off a table. I didn't confront him. Not that night. Instead, I opened my laptop after he went upstairs and logged into the full financial dashboard I had built 3 years earlier. Not just the checking account. Everything. Brokerage accounts. Retirement funds. The joint LLC holding. The home equity line. The mechanical startup equity schedule. He hadn't touched the retirement accounts. Too visible. Too regulated. He targeted liquidity. The $2 million wasn't random. It was almost exactly the amount we could access without triggering immediate tax penalties. It was clean. Strategic. Intentional. I leaned back in my chair and let the truth settle. This wasn't a romantic mistake. It was structural. 3 years earlier, after a market dip shook us, I insisted we restructure everything. Daniel had complained that I was overcomplicating our finances, but he signed the documents anyway. I moved our major assets under a jointly managed LLC for tax efficiency and liability protection. He never read the operating agreement. I wrote most of it myself, working late at the dining table with spreadsheets open and legal templates scattered around me. I remember him laughing and saying, "You're turning our marriage into a corporation." Maybe I was. Buried in that agreement was a clause about unilateral transfers exceeding a specific threshold. Any movement above $500,000 triggered internal review rights for the other partner. It wasn't dramatic. It was precautionary. Every large transaction automatically generated a secondary alert. 2 years ago, after catching him in a small lie about a conference, I quietly restored my parallel access permissions. He never noticed. Now the system was doing exactly what I designed it to do. I pulled up the transaction history and began scrolling backward. $50,000. 3 months ago. Labeled vendor consulting. $75,000. 2 months ago. Equipment deposit. Another $40,000. Miscellaneous services. None of the vendor names matched his engineering firm's actual supplier list. I knew the list by memory. I helped him draft it when he pitched for his first contract. One entry caught my attention. L.M. Consulting. My jaw tightened. I cross-referenced dates with his travel calendar. The transfers lined up perfectly with the weekends he claimed to be visiting project sites. He hadn't just planned a clean exit. He'd been funding it in stages. I opened a new document and started building a timeline. Date. Amount. Destination. Corresponding travel claim. The pattern was undeniable. Then I found something worse. A draft spreadsheet saved in his cloud drive under a bland file name. Relocation budget. It listed projected rent in Toronto, estimated living expenses, private school tuition forecasts, future planning. Bold and optimistic. At the top was a note. Initial capital secured. 2M. Initial capital. As if our life together had become a startup he was pivoting away from. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. I expected rage. Instead, I felt something colder. Recognition. He hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. He'd planned a financial disappearance. And then I saw the refinance column. 6 months ago, Daniel pushed hard to refinance the house. Arguing interest rates were favorable. I had agreed after running the numbers. It increased our accessible equity buffer. He wasn't lowering our payments. He was increasing his runway. I stared at the screen and replayed every conversation about long-term planning. Every time he told me I worried too much about money. Every time he insisted I was too cautious. He needed me cautious. He needed me predictable. What he didn't anticipate was that I tracked everything. Another tab revealed something new. He had applied for a personal line of credit recently. The application listed projected equity in his mechanical startup as collateral. The valuation looked inflated, and the digital signature field bore my name. I pulled up the authentication logs. It wasn't mine. The timestamp didn't match any login I'd made. The IP address was unfamiliar, close to his office location. I felt something shift inside me then, not grief, not anger. Precision. If that signature was falsified, this wasn't just divorce. It was exposure. I forwarded the documentation to a forensic accounting contact I trusted. Subject line simple. Verification request. Then I checked the status of the $2 million wire. Pending settlement. Still suspended in compliance review. Daniel believed it would clear overnight. He was wrong. I glanced toward the staircase where he slept. 8 years of marriage resting quietly above me. I remembered our first home purchase. The pride in his voice when he signed the mortgage documents. The way he squeezed my hand and said, "We're building something solid." He just forgot I built the foundation. I opened the operating agreement again and hovered over the internal review activation panel. The clause I wrote, the safeguard he ignored. If I escalated it formally, the wire wouldn't just freeze. It would become evidence. My phone buzzed softly with a calendar notification. Daniel's flight to Toronto boarded in less than an hour. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I pressed the activation button. A confirmation email arrived seconds later. Compliance review initiated. Somewhere upstairs, Daniel shifted in his sleep. He still believed he was in control. He didn't understand that control wasn't access to money. Control was knowing exactly how the system worked, and I had designed the system. By the time Daniel's alarm went off at 5 a.m, I had already printed every transaction record from the past 6 months. The house was still dark when he came downstairs in jeans and a fitted jacket, rolling his carry-on behind him. He looked almost relaxed. "You're up early?" he said. "Couldn't sleep?" I replied. He nodded, distracted, checking his phone again, waiting. For a moment, I wondered what he was hoping to see. A confirmation from the bank. A message from Lauren. A clean exit. "Flight's at 7, he said casually. "Quick overnight trip." "Montreal?" I asked lightly. He hesitated. Just barely. Toronto. The word hung between us. I watched him take a sip of coffee. He didn't look like a man about to steal $2 million from his wife. He looked like a man on a business trip. Safe travels, I said. He kissed my cheek. I didn't move. When the front door closed, I waited 10 full seconds before opening my laptop again. The transfer status still read, pending, under review. Good. I opened the forensic accounting email. A reply had already arrived. Signature anomaly confirmed. Authentication logs inconsistent with user pattern. Possible unauthorized digital execution. I exhaled slowly. Daniel hadn't just tried to drain our liquidity. He had forged my name to secure backup funding in case the wire failed. This wasn't desperation. This was layered planning. I opened the mechanical startup's equity documents. Daniel owned a minority stake, significant enough to matter in the upcoming acquisition talks. If that acquisition closed, his payout would increase substantially. If he had pledged projected value before it existed, and he had done it without disclosure. I pulled up the LLC operating agreement again and reread the fiduciary duty section. It was clear. Any member acting in a way that materially harmed the marital estate could be subject to review and restriction of authority. I drafted an email to my attorney. Subject: urgent, dissipation and potential forgery. I attached the wire confirmation, the lease agreement, the spreadsheet labeled relocation budget, the forged line of credit application, and the forensic analysis note. Then I wrote 3 sentences. He attempted to transfer $2 million internationally without disclosure. He forged my signature to secure additional credit. The transfer is currently pending under compliance review. I hit send. Within minutes, my phone buzzed. Call me immediately. Her voice was calm. Efficient. You did the right thing activating review. Do not confront him. We'll file for emergency injunction before the transfer window closes. How long do we have? I asked. Depends on the intermediary bank. But once fraud review flags it, settlement slows. I glanced at the flight tracker app. Daniel's flight was boarding. He still believed the money was moving ahead of him. I want full asset preservation, I said, including startup equity. A brief pause. You're thinking ahead. I designed the structure, I replied. He just ignored it. We ended the call with a plan. Immediate filing. Request for temporary restraining order, preventing further asset movement. And formal notice of potential fiduciary breach within the LLC. I returned to the transaction history and kept digging. The smaller transfers, $50,000 here, $75,000 there, had accumulated quietly over months. Enough to cover deposits, furniture, flights, a soft landing. He had been building a second life in increments. One transfer from 3 months ago caught my eye again. Loss. Consulting. I clicked deeper into the routing details. The account linked back to Lauren's name. There it was. Proof that this wasn't emotional improvisation. It was coordination. My phone buzzed again. Daniel. I let it ring. He called a second time. Then a third. I answered on the fourth. Hey, he said. Voice too controlled. Something weird's happening with the account. I leaned back against the kitchen counter. What kind of weird? The wire. It's pending longer than expected. The bank says it's under review. I pictured him at the airport gate, suitcase beside him, trying to maintain composure. That's strange, I said evenly. Did you change anything on the accounts? He asked. There it was. The first crack. I didn't change anything you didn't sign, I replied. Silence on the line. They're asking for additional documentation. He continued. It's just a security thing. International transfers that size usually are, I said. He exhaled sharply. I need it cleared before tomorrow. For what? I asked softly. Another pause. Business. I stared at the printed lease agreement on the table in front of me. Toronto address. 1-year term. You've been busy, I said. He didn't answer that. I'll call the bank, he muttered. It's probably nothing. Probably, I echoed. When he hung up, I felt the shift fully settle. He was no longer confident. He was uncertain. And uncertainty in a man who believed he controlled everything was dangerous. My attorney called back within the hour. Emergency filing submitted. Court clerk has acknowledged receipt. Temporary hearing likely within days. What about the transfer? I asked. The compliance flag increases scrutiny. It won't clear quickly now. I closed my eyes briefly. Daniel's plane lifted off without him knowing the money hadn't followed. He was flying toward a life he believed was already funded. But the foundation had cracked. I gathered the printed documents into a neat stack. Lease. Spreadsheet. Transaction history. Forgery report. Evidence. I looked around the kitchen, the granite counters, the polished floors, the framed wedding photo still hanging near the pantry. He thought control meant access to funds. He never understood that control meant understanding the system better than the person trying to exploit it. And now, every system he touched was watching him. When my phone buzzed again, I didn't need to look to know it was him. For the first time in years, Daniel sounded afraid. The morning after I activated the compliance review, I found something older than the transfer itself. Daniel left before sunrise with his carry-on, dressed like he was heading to a routine site visit. He kissed my cheek lightly, almost distracted. Back tomorrow night, he said. Safe flight, I replied. His eyes searched my face for something, panic. Maybe he didn't find it. The front door closed softly behind him. I waited 10 minutes before opening his cloud archive again. The transfer was the explosion. But explosions usually follow a fuse. 6 months earlier, Daniel had invited a consultant to dinner. He said she was helping his firm coordinate a STEM outreach initiative with local schools. Her name was Lauren Mitchell. I remember that night clearly because I cooked rosemary chicken, roasted potatoes. I even opened the bottle of Cabernet we'd been saving. Lauren arrived in a simple navy dress, hair pulled back neatly. She smiled politely when I greeted her. "It's so nice to finally meet you," she said. Her handshake was firm, her eyes observant. She sat at my dining table, drank my wine, complimented the kitchen renovation I managed last spring. At the time, I thought she seemed slightly nervous. Now I understood she wasn't nervous. She was evaluating. Halfway through dinner, Daniel mentioned our recent refinance. Olivia restructured everything, he said with a light laugh. She's the one who actually understands how this stuff works. Lauren tilted her head slightly. You refinanced under an LLC structure, right? I remember pausing mid-bite. That's correct, I said carefully. She nodded thoughtfully. That's smart, especially if you're planning to scale investments. Scale investments. She wasn't asking out of curiosity. She was gathering context. Back in the present, I scrolled through archived emails from around that date. I found a thread between Daniel and Lauren marked Outreach Logistics. Most of it looked innocent: school schedules, event coordination, budget proposals. But then I noticed attachments: projected growth models, property equity summaries, one document titled Asset Flexibility Scenario Planning. I opened it. It was a simplified breakdown of our liquidity potential, what could be moved quickly, what would require signatures, what was tied to long-term instruments. He hadn't just discussed our marriage with her. He had outlined our financial map. My stomach tightened. I searched further. A Toronto School District logo appeared in Lauren's email signature in later messages. Not just Austin. Not just outreach. She'd already been positioning herself in Canada. One message, sent 3 months ago. Read. If the capital is accessible by Q3, everything lines up perfectly. Capital. Not savings. Not money. Capital. I leaned back and closed my eyes briefly. This wasn't motel rooms and secret lunches. This was strategic intimacy. I opened our text message archive. I'd mirrored it months ago when suspicion first crept in. Daniel told her I was emotionally distant, that I controlled the finances too tightly, that he felt trapped in a corporate marriage. Corporate marriage. The irony almost made me laugh. He framed himself as financially suffocated, as if I had locked him out. But he was the one who tried to drain everything in secret. Scrolling further, I found something worse. A lease agreement draft dated 4 weeks ago. Tenant: Lauren Mitchell. Co-signer: Daniel Harper. Address: Downtown Toronto. High-rise condominium. 1-year term. Rent due first of the month. The security deposit amount was circled in red in a separate message between them. Covered once initial transfer clears? Daniel wrote, "Initial transfer." The $2 million wasn't just an escape. It was their launch fund. I opened the relocation spreadsheet again and studied it more carefully. The budget wasn't reckless. It was detailed. Conservative. Even projected cost of living breakdowns. Insurance adjustments. Travel allotments. This was not passion. It was premeditation. Then I noticed a column labeled post-divorce settlement scenario. My name wasn't mentioned. Just numbers. Percentages. Risk assessment. He had modeled different outcomes depending on how quickly the transfer completed. In one scenario, he assumed I would contest emotionally but lack documentation. I felt something harden inside me. He truly believed I wouldn't see it coming. A notification popped up on my screen. Lauren had resigned from her teaching position effective next month. Public record. Simple announcement in a district memo. She was already stepping out of her life. I imagined her packing books from her classroom, telling colleagues she had an opportunity elsewhere. Maybe she believed she was starting fresh. Maybe she believed him when he said I was unstable. Difficult. Controlling. He told her I was obsessed with money. He told her I wouldn't notice. I saved every file to an encrypted drive. Lease agreement. Relocation budget. Asset flexibility document. Text message transcripts. Then I found something that made my breath catch. A voice memo file saved automatically from his phone. Dated the night before the transfer. He forgot to delete it. I hovered over it for a moment, feeling the weight of what it might contain. Downstairs? The house felt too quiet. Upstairs. Our bedroom door stood slightly open. Bed unmade from where he rushed out before dawn. I clicked play. His voice filled the room. Confident. Assured. Once the money clears, he said, she won't be able to stop us. The words echoed softly against the walls I chose. The furniture I selected. The life I structured. He thought the only thing between him and freedom was time. He didn't realize it was me. And I was already several steps ahead. I listened to the voice memo 3 times before I let myself react. Daniel's voice was calm. Steady. Not rushed. Not emotional. It wasn't the voice of a man caught in passion. It was the voice of a man executing a plan. Once the money clears, she won't be able to stop us, he said. There was a soft laugh in the background. Lauren's, she doesn't even check the big accounts, he continued. Everything's under my control. I paused the audio. Everything's under my control. For a brief second, something like grief tried to rise in my throat. Not because he loved someone else. Not because he wanted to leave. Because he truly believed I was ignorant. I pressed play again. He outlined timing. The wire. The flight. How he would wrap things up quickly once the funds settled. If something delays it, I've got a backup, he said. Backup. That word tightened my chest. I ended the recording and immediately searched his cloud drive for anything labeled credit, loan, or collateral. It didn't take long. 2 weeks before the wire transfer, Daniel applied for a personal line of credit. The collateral listed wasn't cash. It was projected equity from the mechanical startup acquisition. He had leveraged anticipated valuation before it was finalized. I opened the application. There was my name. Electronic signature applied under co-borrower authorization. I checked the metadata. Timestamp: 2. 13 páginas. May. On a Tuesday. Location tag: Daniel's office IP range. I pulled up my authentication history. I was in a strategy meeting across town at that exact time. The signature was forged. I sat back slowly, letting that fact settle. This was no longer just financial betrayal. This was potential fraud. I forwarded the document and the authentication logs to my forensic contact. Minutes later, confirmation arrived. Signature pattern inconsistent. High probability of unauthorized execution. I stared at the phrase. High probability. He didn't just assume I wouldn't notice. He assumed I wouldn't verify. My attorney called within the hour. If this holds up, she said, we're not talking about emotional dissipation anymore. We're talking about fiduciary breach and possible criminal exposure. Will it impact the acquisition? I asked. Absolutely. If he pledged equity without disclosure, the board will want answers. I closed my eyes briefly. Daniel thought he was stepping into a new life funded by clean capital. Instead, he was dragging scrutiny into every corner of his professional world. I returned to the transaction timeline and expanded it further back. Small transfers, spaced carefully over months. 50,000 here, 75 there. Payments labeled as vendor services. Consulting, every single one aligned with weekends he was on site for projects. He hadn't been reckless. He had been disciplined. That hurt more. I opened the relocation spreadsheet again. At the bottom was a line item. Acquisition upside. He had calculated projected payout scenarios from the startup sale. If valuation hit the optimistic range, he expected an additional multi-million-dollar gain. He planned to enter Toronto not as a man starting over modestly, but as someone anticipating exponential growth. He believed he would land clean. I checked the flight tracker. His plane had landed. My phone buzzed seconds later. Daniel, I answered. What did you do? He asked without greeting. I let the silence stretch. The transfer is flagged for fraud review, he continued, voice tight. They're asking for documentation. They said it could take days. International wires that size often trigger compliance. I said evenly. This isn't random, he snapped. Did you activate something? You signed the operating agreement, I replied. A pause. You're blowing this out of proportion. Am I? I asked softly. It's business capital, he insisted. It's temporary. For what business? I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he shifted tactics. Olivia, if this delays too long, it complicates things. Complicates what? Another silence. Then, you wouldn't understand. I almost smiled. I understand perfectly, I said. His breathing changed. Shorter. Less controlled. I've got other financing lined up, he said finally. The backup plan. Is that the line of credit you applied for? I asked. He froze. What are you talking about? The one with my forged signature. The silence that followed was absolute. You're overreacting, he said eventually. But his voice had lost confidence. I'm documenting, I corrected. He exhaled sharply. You're trying to ruin me. No, I said quietly. You did that yourself? He hung up. I set the phone down carefully and stared at the wall for a moment. This wasn't about revenge. It was about containment. I contacted my attorney again and instructed her to amend the emergency filing to include suspected signature forgery and intentional asset dissipation. Within hours, supplemental motions were submitted. Temporary restraining order requested to prevent liquidation of startup equity. Full disclosure demanded for all communications related to pledged shares. Daniel's phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't need to answer to know what it was. If the fraud investigation proceeded, his employer could be notified. And if his employer's compliance department learned he attempted to leverage projected equity without disclosure, the consequences would ripple far beyond our marriage. I walked into the bedroom and looked at the half-packed closet. He thought he was leaving with liquidity and leverage. He didn't realize he was walking into scrutiny. For the first time since that alert buzzed on my phone, I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph, not anger, certainty. He believed the biggest risk in betraying me was emotional fallout. He never imagined the real risk was documentation. And now, every document was aligned against him. Somewhere in Toronto. Daniel was checking his banking app again, refreshing the status. Pending. Under review. Frozen in time. He had planned for everything except one thing. Meh. Daniel called me from Toronto while I was standing in our kitchen. Watching the morning light stretch across the granite counters, we chose together. He didn't bother with a greeting. The bank escalated it, he said. His voice sounded different, thinner. They're saying the transfer triggered a cross-border compliance review. I'm not surprised, I replied. They flagged it as potential fraud. There it was. The word he had hoped would never surface. That's serious, I said calmly. Olivia, this is ridiculous. It's our money. Our money, I repeated softly. He inhaled sharply. Can you call them? Explain that it's legitimate. That we both authorized it. I leaned against the counter. Did we both authorize it? Silence crackled across the line. At the other end, I could hear airport announcements echoing faintly. He hadn't even left the terminal yet. Maybe he never made it past the gate. They declined my card at the lounge, he muttered. They temporarily restricted the secondary business account too. This is spreading. That caught my attention. The business account. I asked. They're reviewing linked transactions, he said. This is going to create a mess. It already had. I didn't change anything you didn't sign, I said evenly. He exhaled through his teeth. This isn't about signatures. This is about trust. Trust. He had moved $2 million across international lines without a word. You're the one who transferred the funds, I replied. It was for business. Which business? I asked again. He didn't answer. Instead, he shifted tone. Softer now. We can fix this. Just call the bank. Tell them there's no fraud. If there's no fraud, the review will clear on its own, I said. His breathing became uneven. I'm boarding soon, he said. I can't deal with this mid-flight. I thought you already landed, I said quietly. Another pause. I delayed, he admitted. Of course he did. He wasn't flying toward Lauren with uncertainty. He wanted the money confirmed first. My phone vibrated with a new message. Unknown Canadian number. I glanced down. Hi, Olivia. This is Lauren. I think there's some confusion with the transfer. Daniel said everything was handled. Is something wrong? I almost admired the audacity. She had my number. Daniel must have given it to her. He must have believed I would either ignore her or explode. I typed nothing back. Olivia. Daniel's voice pulled me back. I'm here. Have you talked to a lawyer? He asked suddenly. There it was. Fear. Why would I need one? I asked lightly. Because this is escalating, he snapped. You don't understand how these things look. I understand exactly how they look. He fell silent again. I'll fix it, he said finally. I'll call the bank manager directly. You should, I replied. After we hung up, I forwarded Lauren's text to my attorney. Within minutes, she responded. This shows coordinated planning. Keep all communications. Coordinated planning. Not romance. Planning. Lauren texted again. Daniel said you're upset. He told me you two were already in the process of separating. I don't want to be involved in anything messy. I stared at the words. He had told her we were separating. He had told her I was emotionally unstable. He had told her I controlled everything. I opened the court filing confirmation email on my laptop. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Submitted 12 hours prior. Temporary restraining order pending review. He was right about one thing. We were separating. He just didn't know it yet. My phone rang again. Daniel. What now? I answered. They scheduled a compliance interview, he said. They're asking for documentation supporting the wire purpose. That sounds standard. It's not standard when it's flagged as suspicious. Suspicious. That depends on the context, I said. I told them it was a business investment. In what? He hesitated. You're making this worse, he said finally. No, I replied quietly. You did. There was a shift in his tone then. Something darker. You have no idea what you just started, he said. The words landed heavier than the others. What does that mean? I asked. It means if this spirals, it doesn't just hurt me. Was that a threat? Or a warning? Daniel, I said carefully, if you lose something because of your own decisions. That's not something I started. He breathed heavily into the phone. I'm coming back tonight, he said. Safe travels, I replied. He hung up abruptly. I looked down at the compliance notification on my screen. Transfer status. Pending. Fraud review escalated. Estimated settlement. Delayed. Lauren's final message appeared. I didn't know about any of this. Please tell me what's happening. I considered responding. Instead, I attached one document. The first page of the divorce filing. No message. No explanation. Just proof. A minute later, the typing indicator appeared, then disappeared. No further texts. I walked through the living room slowly, taking in the framed photos, the carefully arranged furniture, the quiet symmetry of the life we built. He believed the biggest risk in betraying me was confrontation. He expected tears, accusations, chaos. He did not expect paperwork. He did not expect compliance reviews. He did not expect a system designed to protect against exactly what he attempted. When my phone buzzed again, I didn't look. I already knew the dynamic had shifted. He left thinking he controlled the money. He would return knowing he controlled nothing. And somewhere between Toronto and home, he would realize that the woman he underestimated was the only thing standing between him and collapse. He just didn't know how close that collapse already was. I woke up to 12 missed calls, and none of them were from Daniel. The first voicemail was from his mother. How could you do this to him? She demanded, her voice trembling with outrage. Freezing accounts. Filing things behind his back. This is not how marriage works. The second was from his sister. I can't believe you're destroying the family over money, she said. He told us everything. Everything. I sat up in bed, staring at the ceiling for a long moment before checking my phone again. A mutual friend had sent a short message. He says you locked him out of his own accounts. That you're trying to financially trap him. I almost laughed. Daniel had wasted no time. He wasn't just fighting me legally. He was rewriting the story. By the time I made coffee, the narrative had already begun circulating through his side of the family. According to Daniel, the $2 million transfer was a legitimate business expansion. According to Daniel, I had reacted emotionally and weaponized the accounts out of spite. According to Daniel, I was unstable. He framed himself as financially abused. The audacity would have been impressive if it weren't so predictable. I opened my laptop and checked the compliance portal. Status unchanged. Under review? Good. My phone buzzed again. A colleague from Daniel's engineering firm. Hey, I don't want to get involved. But HR mentioned there's some kind of financial dispute impacting his role. Just thought you should know. HR. It had reached his company already. Of course it had. The pledged equity. The fraud review. The compliance escalation. If the bank flagged the transaction and the startup's projected shares were tied to a line of credit application, someone in corporate compliance would notice. Daniel hadn't just risked our marriage. He had entangled his career. My phone rang again. His mother. I answered this time. You're humiliating him, she said immediately. Do you have any idea what this looks like? I do, I replied calmly. He was planning to expand his business. That's all. And you froze $2 million out of jealousy. It wasn't jealousy, I said. Then what was it? Documentation, I thought. He transferred marital assets without disclosure, I said aloud. That has consequences. He's your husband. He was... Silence filled the line. You're overreacting, she whispered. Judges don't like wives who escalate. I almost smiled. Judges like evidence, I replied. She hung up. Within the hour, a certified letter arrived by courier. Daniel's attorney, The language was formal, polished, aggressive, allegations of financial coercion, claims that I improperly restricted access to joint funds, demand for immediate mediation. He was shifting from defense to offense. He wanted to frame me as the aggressor. I forwarded the letter to my attorney. Her response was immediate. Stay calm. We respond with evidence. Evidence. I opened the encrypted drive and reviewed everything again. The wire transfer confirmation. The lease agreement in Toronto. The relocation budget spreadsheet. The voice memo. The forged digital signature. Not emotion. Structure. Another notification appeared. Startup acquisition talks had been officially announced. Valuation discussions accelerated. Daniel's equity stake had just become significantly more valuable, which meant his attempted pledge of projected shares now mattered even more. If misconduct was proven, the board could restrict his participation entirely. His panic suddenly made more sense. This wasn't just about $2 million anymore. It was about future millions. My phone lit up again. Daniel. I let it ring twice before answering. What did you send my lawyer? He demanded. The truth, I said. You're making this public? You did that when you transferred the money. I was trying to protect my future. At whose expense? I asked quietly. He exhaled sharply. My promotion review is on hold, he said. HR called me in. They're asking about the equity pledge. Did you tell them you used my signature? I asked. Silence. You're destroying everything, he said finally. No, I replied evenly. I'm protecting what's mine. You could have handled this privately. You could have told me. He didn't answer that. Instead, he shifted tone again. Let's mediate. I'll reverse the transfer. We can settle quietly. You can't reverse what hasn't cleared, I said. Another silence. He knew. He knew the transfer was frozen because of the system I built. I never thought you'd go this far, he said. That was your mistake. After we hung up, I checked social media out of habit. Daniel's sister had posted something vague. Some women weaponize money instead of working on their marriage. Comments poured in. Supportive. Angry. Speculative. I closed the app. Reputation warfare was loud but shallow. Court filings were quiet and permanent. An email arrived from my attorney. We're filing a motion to amend asset division request based on intentional dissipation and potential fraud. Prepare for a full evidentiary hearing. I read it twice. This was no longer about freezing an account. It was about redefining the entire financial outcome of our divorce. Daniel thought public sympathy would intimidate me. He thought family loyalty would pressure me. He underestimated how little noise mattered when documentation was clean. That evening, my phone buzzed again. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. I answered. His voice was different. Not angry. Not defensive. Afraid. They're expanding the review, he said quietly. Corporate compliance wants full disclosure. If this goes further, it could get reported. Reported. To regulators. To the board. To anyone who cared about fiduciary duty. I didn't do that. I said. You triggered it. I activated a clause you signed. Silence stretched between us. You have no idea what you've started, he whispered. I looked around the living room, the framed wedding photo still on the shelf. The furniture we chose. The life he tried to liquidate. Oh, I said softly. I know exactly what I started. And for the first time since this began, I realized something clearly. He wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing control. And control was already gone. Daniel came home 3 days later with a suitcase and a look I had never seen on his face before. Not anger. Not arrogance. Calculation. He walked into the house as if it still belonged to him in the same way it always had. The scent of his cologne lingered in the air before he even spoke. We need to talk, he said. I didn't move from the dining table where I was reviewing financial projections for work. We are talking, I replied. He set his suitcase down slowly. Not like this. I closed my laptop and looked at him fully for the first time since he left for Toronto. He looked tired. dark circles under his eyes. Jaw clenched. "You blindsided me," he said. "You wired $2 million without telling me. That's not the same thing. It is when it's marital property." He ran a hand through his hair. "You've turned this into a legal war. You started it when you planned a new life with someone else." His eyes flickered. So he knew that I knew. "I wasn't leaving you," he said too quickly. "You signed a 12-month lease in Toronto. That was temporary. You created a relocation budget spreadsheet. That was planning. You pledged startup equity without disclosure." He stopped talking. For a moment, the silence felt heavy enough to fracture the room. "You went through my files," he said finally. "I reviewed shared assets. You invaded my privacy." I almost laughed. "You transferred our money." He stepped closer. Not aggressively, just enough to try to reclaim space. "You've humiliated me," he said quietly. "My family thinks I'm a criminal. My company is reviewing my compliance record. Lauren won't return my calls." Lauren. So she had pulled away. "That wasn't my doing," I said evenly. "You sent her the divorce filing." "Yes. You could have handled that differently." "How?" His jaw tightened. "She thought we were separated." "We weren't." "You're punishing me." "No," I said softly. "I'm protecting myself." His voice shifted then. Less defensive. More desperate. "If this goes to court, it gets ugly. It already is. I'll agree to mediation," he said quickly. "We divide the assets evenly. No allegations. No fraud claims. We move on. Evenly. After attempting to drain $2 million and conceal equity pledges, you're asking for mercy," I said. "I'm asking for fairness." I stood up slowly. "Fairness would have been a conversation before you transferred the money." He didn't respond. Instead, he changed tactics. "You don't understand how exposed this makes me," he said. "If the board decides I breached fiduciary duty, that's not my responsibility. You could stop this." I held his gaze. "I could have stopped it the night you moved the money," I said. "I chose to let the system do what it was designed to do." His shoulders dropped slightly. "You've changed," he said. "No," I replied. "I just stopped being convenient." He looked around the house as if measuring what he might lose. "This is still my home," he said. "For now," I answered. That word hung between us. "For now," he exhaled slowly. "What do you want?" The question wasn't rhetorical. He needed to know the cost. "I want full financial disclosure," I said. "Every account. Every pledged asset. Every communication tied to the transfer. That's excessive. It's standard. You're enjoying this." "No," I said. "I'm done tolerating it." His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Then away. "Who is it?" I asked. "No one." "Lauren," I asked calmly. He didn't answer. The silence was confirmation. "You told her we were separating," I said. "She believed we were." "You made her believe that." He rubbed his temples. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this." "What was supposed to happen?" I asked. He hesitated. "You were supposed to sign the transfer authorization without looking too closely," he said quietly. "You usually don't micromanage finances." That hit harder than I expected. "Usually, you miscalculated," I said. He let out a dry laugh. Clearly, we stood there in the quiet house. Two people who had shared a life, now negotiating its dismantling. "Corporate compliance wants documentation by Friday," he said finally. "If I can't prove legitimacy, they escalate. Then you should prepare documentation," I replied. "You could testify it was mutual." "I won't lie." He looked at me as if I'd betrayed him. "You'd really let my career collapse. You were willing to let my financial security collapse." His face hardened. "This isn't over," he said. "I know." He picked up his suitcase and walked upstairs. I remained in the dining room, listening to the familiar sounds of him moving through the bedroom, drawers opening, hangers sliding, the quiet dismantling of shared space. A few minutes later, I received an email notification from my attorney. Daniel's legal team had formally requested emergency mediation and temporary injunction relief. Translation: he was trying to unfreeze the funds before the compliance review concluded. I forwarded the notification back with a single sentence. Proceed with evidentiary disclosure. Seconds later, my attorney replied, understood. Be prepared for a counterattack. Counterattack. That word settled into my chest like a weight. Daniel wasn't finished. He would try to discredit me, shift blame, frame me as vindictive, maybe even claim emotional instability. I knew his patterns. He escalated when cornered. Upstairs, a door slammed. He was angry again. Not because he loved me. Not because he regretted Lauren. Because he had lost leverage. I picked up my phone and checked the compliance portal once more. Transfer status. Under extended review. No settlement. No clearance. $2 million suspended in limbo. So was his future. So was our marriage. And for the first time since he walked through the door, I felt something close to clarity. He thought coming home would intimidate me. He thought proximity would weaken my resolve. He forgot something fundamental. I built systems for a living. I anticipated failure points. And I never launched anything without contingency planning. He was standing in the middle of a system he didn't understand, and it was still tightening around him. The first formal hearing was scheduled for 8:30 on a gray Monday morning, and Daniel arrived looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. I saw him before he saw me. He stood near the courthouse entrance in a tailored navy suit that used to signal confidence. Now it just looked like armor. His attorney stood beside him, speaking in low, controlled tones. When his eyes finally found mine, something flickered there, resentment, fear, maybe disbelief that I had actually followed through. I didn't look away. Inside the courtroom, everything felt smaller than I expected. Fluorescent lights, neutral walls, the quiet murmur of other cases being processed. Ordinary. That was the unsettling part. The dismantling of a marriage did not require dramatic music or raised voices. It required documentation. When our case was called, we took our seats. My attorney began with precision. Intentional dissipation of marital assets. Undisclosed international wire transfer of $2 million. Attempted pledge of projected startup equity without spousal consent. Supporting exhibits attached. The words sounded clinical, almost detached. Daniel's attorney stood to respond. He argued business intent. Claimed the transfer was part of a legitimate investment opportunity. Suggested that I had acted prematurely and vindictively by triggering fraud review mechanisms. Vindictive. I kept my hands folded in my lap. The judge asked a single question. Was full disclosure provided to the spouse prior to the transfer? Silence from Daniel's side. His attorney pivoted. There were ongoing marital discussions regarding separation. The judge looked at Daniel. Were you legally separated at the time of the transfer? Daniel's jaw tightened. No. The word landed heavier than anything else that morning. No. Not separated. Not disclosed. Not authorized. My attorney presented the lease agreement in Toronto, the relocation budget spreadsheet, the time-stamped transfer, then the equity pledge document with the digital signature discrepancy highlighted. Daniel shifted in his seat. The judge leaned forward slightly. Did you intend to relocate outside the country at the time of this transfer? Daniel hesitated. It was exploratory, he said. Did your spouse know about this exploration? No. The courtroom fell quiet. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. But procedure was enough. The judge issued a temporary order reaffirming the freeze on disputed funds and restricting any further asset movement until full evidentiary review. Daniel's request for emergency relief was denied. His shoulders stiffened. But he remained composed until we stepped outside. You're enjoying this, he said under his breath. No, I replied calmly. I'm surviving it. His attorney pulled him aside before he could say more. As I walked toward the parking structure, my phone buzzed. An email from my attorney. Corporate compliance has requested a copy of the court's temporary order. They are escalating internal review. It was spreading again. Not because I pushed it. Because the documentation existed. By afternoon, Daniel texted me. We need to talk privately. I ignored it. An hour later, he called. I answered. They're suspending my equity privileges pending investigation, he said without greeting. That's between you and your board. They're questioning whether the pledge constituted misrepresentation. Did it? Silence. They're using your filing as justification. They're using facts. I corrected. You could withdraw the fraud allegation. I didn't make one, I said evenly. The bank did. His breathing was sharp. If this goes further, it could trigger regulatory reporting. Then you should consult your counsel. You're hiding behind lawyers. I'm standing behind documentation. He exhaled heavily. I made a mistake, he said suddenly. It was the first time he'd said anything close to that. A mistake, I repeated. I shouldn't have structured it like that. Structured it. Not shouldn't have done it. Just structured it better. That's not what you regret, I said quietly. He didn't argue. You're going to cost me everything, he said. You risked everything. There was a pause, and then his tone shifted again. You know what they're saying about you. I don't care. They think you're cold. Cold is different from careless. He ended the call abruptly. That evening, I received a notification from LinkedIn. Daniel had updated his profile status to open to new opportunities. The timing was not subtle. He was preparing for fallout, or expecting it. Later that night, another email arrived from my attorney. Opposing counsel is requesting mediation again. They're offering a revised asset split significantly less favorable to him. Less favorable, which meant the pressure was working. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the dark window reflecting my own face. I didn't look triumphant. I looked tired. But steady. Daniel thought the biggest threat was the frozen $2 million. He was wrong. The greater threat was exposure, fiduciary responsibility, regulatory scrutiny, board-level concern, reputation risk. He built his identity on precision and competence. Now both were under review, and none of it came from shouting. None of it came from revenge fantasies. It came from one decision: documentation instead of denial. When my phone vibrated again, I didn't rush to check it. For the first time since this began, I understood the balance had shifted completely. He wasn't negotiating from strength anymore. He was negotiating from containment. And containment rarely held forever. The mediation was scheduled for Friday afternoon, and Daniel arrived alone. His attorney had advised him to appear composed. Cooperative? Reasonable. He looked none of those things. He looked contained. We sat across from each other in a sterile conference room inside a private mediation office downtown. A long polished table separated us. Neutral artwork hung on the walls. The mediator, a woman in her late 50s with unreadable eyes, reviewed the file silently. This session is confidential, she began. The goal is resolution. Resolution. Daniel nodded stiffly. I remained still. His attorney presented the revised proposal first. He would forfeit the Toronto relocation lease, withdraw the equity pledge documentation, agree to an uneven division of liquid assets. In exchange, I would drop allegations related to intentional dissipation and refrain from forwarding additional documentation to corporate compliance. There it was. Containment. He wasn't fighting for fairness anymore. He was fighting for silence. The mediator turned to me. Your response? I opened the folder in front of me slowly. I'm willing to negotiate asset division, I said calmly. But I will not withdraw factual filings. Daniel leaned forward. You've made your point, he said tightly. You froze the money. You embarrassed me. What more do you want? Truth, I thought. But I didn't say it. I want disclosure, I said instead. Full financial transparency, including all external accounts and any additional pledged interests. His attorney stiffened. There are no additional accounts, she said quickly. I slid a document across the table. A secondary brokerage report linked to a holding structure tied to the startup's anticipated acquisition. Daniel's face changed. Subtle, but visible. You didn't disclose this, I said evenly. That's projected equity, he snapped. It hasn't vested. It was still used as leverage. The mediator's pen paused. Mr. Harper, she said. Is there anything else that should be disclosed at this time? He hesitated. That hesitation lasted less than 3 seconds. But it felt infinite. No, he said. The mediator nodded slowly. But something in her expression shifted. I closed the folder gently. There's more, I said. Daniel's head snapped toward me. I placed a printed email on the table. Corporate compliance correspondence. They had requested clarification regarding representations made during preliminary acquisition talks. Specifically, they were reviewing whether pledged equity had been mischaracterized in financing documentation. His attorney's composure fractured slightly. This mediation is not the venue for corporate issues, she said sharply. It is if those issues affect marital asset valuation, I replied calmly. The mediator looked directly at Daniel. Are you currently under internal investigation? Silence. Yes, he said finally. The word landed harder than any accusation. The room shifted. It was no longer about $2 million. It was about credibility. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if something inside him had given way. I didn't think it would escalate, he said quietly. It escalated because you concealed, I said. I was protecting my future. You were protecting a narrative. His jaw tightened. You've turned this into a public spectacle. I filed in court, I replied. You told your family and colleagues. His eyes darkened. You could have handled this privately. You could have handled it honestly. The mediator raised her hand slightly. Let's redirect, she said. Mr. Harper, are you prepared to provide full financial disclosure and amend prior representations? Daniel looked at the table, then at his attorney, then at me. His voice was lower when he spoke. Yes. The word felt less like agreement and more like surrender. The mediator outlined next steps. Forensic accounting review. Full disclosure affidavit. Temporary equity restrictions until investigation conclusion. Revised asset valuation schedule. Daniel listened without interruption. For the first time since this began, he wasn't arguing. He was calculating damage. When the session paused for a brief recess, he approached me quietly near the hallway. You could still stop this, he said. I'm not the one investigating you, I replied. You're the catalyst. You were the decision. He looked exhausted. You've destroyed everything, he whispered. I studied his face. The anger was gone. The arrogance was gone. What remained was fear. No, I said softly. You did that the night you thought I wouldn't notice. He shook his head slowly. You always needed to win, he said. This isn't about winning, I replied. It's about boundaries. He didn't respond. When we returned to the conference room, the mediator presented a preliminary settlement framework. Significantly reduced equity claim for Daniel. Majority control of liquid assets allocated to me. Continued freeze on the disputed $2 million until final court ruling. Mandatory disclosure timeline. Daniel signed the interim agreement without argument. His hand trembled slightly. Afterward, as we exited the building separately, I felt no triumph. Just clarity. He had believed money was leverage. He believed silence was strategy. He believed I would react emotionally and make mistakes. Instead, I documented. Instead, I waited. Instead, I let the system do what it was built to do. My phone buzzed as I reached my car. A notification from the compliance portal. Internal review escalated to formal audit. I stared at the screen for a moment. The $2 million were still frozen. But that was no longer the center of gravity. The real consequence was unfolding elsewhere. Daniel thought mediation would contain the damage. He didn't understand something fundamental. Containment only works when the foundation isn't already cracked. And his foundation was splitting in ways even he couldn't yet see. The evidentiary hearing was set for a Thursday afternoon, and by then Daniel no longer looked angry, he looked cornered. The courtroom was quieter than the first time. No emergency motions. No aggressive posturing. Just documents stacked in neat folders and a judge who had clearly read every page. I sat beside my attorney. Hands steady. Spine straight. Daniel sat across from me. His expression carefully neutral. But neutrality requires energy, and he was running out of it. His attorney opened with a new strategy. They argued that the transfer had been mischaracterized, that Daniel's intent had not been concealment but financial restructuring in anticipation of marital dissolution. Restructuring. The word was chosen deliberately. The judge flipped through the exhibits. Was dissolution filed at the time of the transfer? She asked. No. Daniel's attorney admitted. Was there written agreement regarding separation? No. Was the relocation lease disclosed? Silence. My attorney stood. She presented the timeline again. Wire transfer initiated at 11. 47 pages. Lease signed 2 weeks prior. Equity pledge executed without documented consent. Divorce petition filed 12 hours after transfer. Temporary order issued. Compliance review triggered. Corporate investigation opened. Each event aligned. Each timestamp confirmed. Daniel's attorney attempted to argue that the freeze had damaged his professional standing unfairly. The judge interrupted. Professional consequences are separate from marital asset protection. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. My attorney introduced the internal email Daniel had sent to the Toronto broker. Subject line. Post-transfer timeline. The body referenced finalizing personal separation once capital is secured. The judge read it silently, then looked up. Mr. Carter, did you intend to secure marital funds prior to informing your spouse of separation? Daniel hesitated. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently. But hesitation had already spoken. Yes, he said finally. The word was barely audible, but it was enough. The courtroom felt colder, not dramatic, not explosive. Just final. The judge issued her preliminary findings. Intentional dissipation of marital assets. Failure to disclose material financial commitments. Violation of fiduciary duty within marriage. The frozen $2 million would remain restricted pending final asset division. Additionally, the court would consider disproportionate allocation of remaining marital property due to attempted concealment. Daniel's face shifted then. Not anger. Recognition. The system had spoken. Outside the courtroom. He tried one last time. You didn't have to go that far, he said. I didn't, I replied. You did? I was scared, he admitted quietly. Of what? Losing control. There it was. Not losing me. Not losing the marriage. Control. You lost that the moment you thought I wouldn't notice, I said. He looked at me as if searching for something softer. There wasn't anything left to find. I never thought you'd fight like this, he said. I never thought I'd have to... His attorney called his name. He turned away. I watched him walk down the courthouse steps, shoulders slightly hunched, phone already pressed to his ear. Damage control. My phone buzzed moments later. An email from my attorney. Corporate counsel has requested a certified copy of the court's fiduciary finding. That was the real consequence. Not the money. The record. Once documented. Fiduciary breach didn't disappear. It followed. Through boardrooms. Through compliance reviews. Through reference checks. I stood on the courthouse steps for a long moment after he left. The sky was clear. The air cool. There was no applause. No dramatic soundtrack. Just the quiet recognition that something irreversible had happened. That night, Daniel sent one final message. I never meant to hurt you. I stared at it. Then typed a single response. You meant to protect yourself. There was no reply. Later, I received confirmation that his startup's board had formally suspended his equity participation pending the outcome of regulatory review. Temporary. They called it, temporary often becomes permanent. I closed my laptop and walked through the house slowly. The wedding photo was no longer on the shelf. The space where it had stood looked strangely balanced. For months, I had thought the greatest fear was confrontation. It wasn't. The greatest fear was clarity. Clarity stripped away excuses. Clarity replaced emotion with evidence. Clarity forced accountability. Daniel believed he was orchestrating an exit strategy. He never realized he was documenting his own unraveling. And now, there was nothing left to negotiate. Only consequences. Only division. Only forward. 6 months later, the house felt quieter, but not emptier. Silence no longer carried tension. It carried space. The final decree had been signed 3 weeks earlier. The court awarded me the majority share of the liquid assets, full ownership of the house, and a disproportionate portion of Daniel's vested equity based on the fiduciary breach finding. The frozen $2 million had been reallocated according to the ruling. The numbers were precise. Clean. Documented. Daniel's name no longer appeared beside mine on any account. His suspension at the startup became permanent. The board cited irreconcilable governance concerns. The regulatory inquiry concluded without criminal charges. But the internal findings followed him quietly. He accepted a mid-level engineering position at a smaller firm outside the city. Lauren had left Toronto before the lease officially ended. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. On a bright Monday morning, I stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and reviewed a presentation deck for the executive board at my company. 2 months earlier, I had been promoted to Director of Product Strategy. My boss had told me something during the interview process that stayed with me. "You remain calm under pressure," she said. "You operate on structure, not panic." She didn't know how literal that was. I walked through the house slowly before leaving for work, noticing the subtle changes. The second bedroom had become an office. The walls had been repainted a lighter shade. The air felt different. Not triumphant. Not bitter. Just stable. Daniel had sent one final email after the decree. "I hope one day you can forgive me." I didn't respond. Forgiveness wasn't the center of this story. Boundaries were at work. My team gathered around the conference table, unaware of the private war that had unfolded behind the composure I maintained for months. They saw clarity. They saw leadership. They didn't see the nights I reviewed bank statements until 2 a.m, or the hours spent organizing exhibits for court, or the moment I realized that the person I trusted most had already built a plan that excluded me. That knowledge had changed something fundamental. Not my capacity to love, but my capacity to ignore. Later that evening, I attended a small financial literacy workshop for women navigating divorce. I hadn't planned to speak. But when the facilitator asked if anyone wanted to share their experience, I stood. "I didn't win," I said simply. I prepared. The room grew still. I didn't scream. I didn't retaliate. I documented. I read every clause. I understood the systems around me. A few women nodded. One of them wiped her eyes quietly. I thought protecting myself would feel like revenge. I continued. It didn't. It felt like stability. Afterward, several stayed behind to ask questions. About joint accounts. About asset freezes. About digital signatures. About reading what you sign. I answered each one carefully. Not with anger. With clarity. That night, when I returned home, I sat at the kitchen island, the same place where my phone had vibrated 6 months earlier with the notification that changed everything. The granite surface felt cool beneath my fingertips. I remembered the exact moment. The wire transfer alert. The recipient name. The decision not to confront. That was the real pivot point. Not the court ruling. Not the equity suspension. Not the settlement. The pivot was restraint. Daniel thought I would react emotionally. He thought I would make noise. He never anticipated silence. Silence gave me time. Time gave me evidence. Evidence gave me leverage. Leverage gave me freedom. I picked up my phone and scrolled briefly through old messages, then closed the thread permanently. There was nothing left to revisit. No dramatic ending. No explosive confrontation. Just the quiet understanding that power isn't about destruction. It's about awareness. And awareness changes everything. If you've ever felt underestimated, if you've ever been told you were overreacting, if you've ever discovered something that made your world tilt off its axis, pause, read, prepare, understand the structure you're standing on. Because the strongest move isn't always the loudest one. Sometimes it's the one that leaves you standing steady while everything unstable collapses on its own. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about trust, money, or power, share your thoughts below. I read every comment. And if you believe in protecting yourself through knowledge instead of panic, stay with this channel. Subscribe. Because sometimes the most important battles are fought quietly and won long before anyone realizes what's happening. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.